Rain hammered against the emergency room windows of Metropolitan Hospital as Dr. Kimberly Washington rushed through her final rounds of a 16-hour shift. She'd been looking forward to getting home to her daughter's science fair project, but the weather had other plans. 3 car accidents had already come through their doors tonight, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. Dr. Washington, the overhead speaker crackled with urgency. Level 1 trauma alert, arriving in 2 minutes. She was already moving, her white coat flying behind her as she sprinted down the fluorescent-lit corridor. The emergency team fell into step beside her, their footsteps echoing in unified purpose. Through the glass doors, emergency lights painted the rain-slicked pavement in alternating red and white. "What do we have?" she called to Jake, the charge nurse, as they pushed through to the ambulance bay. Female, mid-40s, collapsed at the Sterling Foundation Gala. Severe chest pain, irregular heartbeat, possible aortic dissection. Jake checked his tablet. BP's through the roof, -185/110. Lightning split the sky as paramedics wrestled a gurney through the downpour. The patient lay partially conscious, her elegant black evening gown soaked with rain and spilled champagne. A diamond tennis bracelet glinted under the emergency lights, her manicured hand clutching her chest. "This is Sarah Bennett," one paramedic shouted over the thunder. Started experiencing chest pain during her speech, then collapsed. "She's been in and out of consciousness." Dr. Washington's breath caught. Everyone knew Sarah Bennett. Her family owned half the shopping centers in town, and her face regularly graced the society pages of the local newspaper. More importantly, she was a major hospital donor. "Get her into Bay 1, Dr. Washington ordered, already assessing the patient's gray complexion and labored breathing. "I need a 12-lead EKG, stat." Sarah's eyes fluttered open as they transferred her to the trauma bay bed. Her gaze focused on Dr. Washington, then widened in obvious alarm. "No," she slurred, trying to push away Dr. Washington's hands. Don't let that black woman touch me. I need a real doctor." The room fell silent except for the beeping monitors. Dr. Washington felt the familiar punch to the gut, the one she'd learned to take without flinching during her 15 years of practice. She continued her examination, her voice steady and professional. "Mrs. Bennett, I'm Dr. Kimberly Washington, Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery. You're experiencing a cardiac event, and we need to." "Didn't you hear me?" Sarah's voice grew stronger, fueled by panic and prejudice. "Get me someone else. A real American doctor." She grabbed Jake's sleeve. You get me another doctor. Someone qualified." Jake's face flushed red. "Mrs. Bennett, Dr. Washington is the most qualified." "I don't care. I won't have her." Sarah's words cut off in a gasp of pain. The monitors shrieked as her blood pressure plummeted. "She's crashing," Dr. Washington shouted, already reaching for the crash cart. "Push one of Ebby." In that moment, Dr. Washington noticed something on the EKG that made her blood run cold. The pattern was distinctive, a rare type of aortic dissection she'd written her thesis about. Traditional surgical approaches had a mere 20% survival rate. Only her innovative procedure, which she'd successfully performed just 3 times before, offered any real chance of survival. "Get an OR prepped now," she ordered, then turned to the staff. And someone paged Dr. Harrison. Harrison was the only other cardiothoracic surgeon on call, but she already knew he was at a conference in Phoenix. The charge nurse confirmed her fears. "Dr. Harrison's unavailable. You're the only cardiosurgeon we've got." Sarah's eyes rolled back as she seized, her designer dress now soaked with sweat instead of rain. Her lips moved, trying to form words, probably more slurs, but only a weak moan escaped. Dr. Washington felt the weight of every eye in the room. They all knew Sarah Bennett's reputation, her influence, her politics. They'd seen her at anti-integration rallies, heard her speeches about traditional values. One wrong move, One slip during surgery, and the hospital could face a lawsuit that would shut down their entire cardiac program. But beneath the expensive dress and layers of prejudice lay a dying human being. Dr. Washington thought of her grandmother, who died of a treatable condition because the only hospital in 1960s Alabama that would admit her didn't have qualified doctors for people of color. "Get her 2 or 3, Dr. Washington commanded, her voice cutting through the tension. "We have less than 30 minutes to get in there and repair this dissection, or she dies. Period." As they rushed down the corridor, Sarah's hand suddenly grabbed Dr. Washington's wrist. Her eyes were wide with fear, all pretense stripped away by the nearness of death. For a brief moment, she wasn't a racist donor or a social elite. She was just a terrified human being facing her mortality. Dr. Washington leaned down. "Mrs. Bennett, I'm going to save your life today," she said firmly. "You can hate me for it tomorrow." Thunder shook the hospital windows as they pushed through the doors, where Dr. Washington would soon hold her critic's heart, quite literally, in her hands. "Dr. Washington." Hospital Administrator David Chen's voice cut through the chaos of pre-op preparations. "A moment, please." Dr. Washington glanced at the clock. 26 minutes until Sarah Bennett's chances of survival dropped below 10%. Still, she followed Chen into the small consultation room, her surgical cap already on, hands freshly scrubbed. Lightning flashed through the small window, illuminating Chen's worried face. At 42, he was the youngest administrator in the hospital's history, and right now, he looked every bit the man caught between duty and politics. "The Bennett family," he began, then paused to loosen his tie. "They donated over $12 million to this hospital. They funded our entire pediatric wing. And in about 24 minutes, Sarah Bennett will be dead unless I operate." Dr. Washington kept her voice level, though her fingers tightened around her surgical mask. "Is that what you called me in here to discuss?" Chen ran a hand through his graying hair. "Her husband's on the phone with their lawyer right now. They're demanding we airlift her to City General. Says they'll sue us if we don't. In this storm. No helicopter can fly in this weather." Through the window, another lightning bolt turned night to day. "And City General is an hour away by ground transport. She'll be dead before they reach the city limits." "I know." Chen's shoulders sagged. "But if you operate and anything goes wrong, anything at all, they'll destroy this hospital. They'll destroy you." Dr. Washington felt a familiar weight settle in her chest, the same weight she'd carried since medical school, through her residency, through every promotion and achievement. The weight of knowing she'd have to be twice as good to be considered half as qualified. "Did I ever tell you about my grandmother, David?" He shook his head. "Alabama, 1963. She had acute appendicitis. 3 hospitals turned her away because they didn't serve her kind. The 4th admitted her but wouldn't let their white surgeons touch her. By the time they found a black doctor from 2 counties over, her appendix had ruptured. She adjusted her surgical cap with steady hands. She died of sepsis while my mother watched." Thunder rumbled overhead as Chen absorbed this. "Kimberly, I'm sorry, but this is different. This is exactly the same." Her voice carried the weight of generations. "A woman is dying, and I can save her. Everything else is just noise." The door burst open. Jake, still in his trauma bay scrubs, rushed in. "Dr. Washington." Her pressure's dropping again. "The family's here, and they're threatening to call the medical board if you touch her." Chen stepped forward. "We could transfer her. Document that it was the family's choice. Protect ourselves legally." Dr. Washington closed her eyes for a moment. Behind her lids, she saw her grandmother's face. Then she saw Sarah Bennett's terrified eyes in the trauma bay, stripped of everything but basic human fear. When she opened them again, her decision was made. "You know what's interesting, David? This particular type of aortic dissection. It's called a type of variant. Only 4 surgeons in the country have successfully repaired it." She started toward the door. "I'm one of them. I pioneered the technique they teach at Mass General now. So here's what's going to happen. I'm going to walk into that OR and save that woman's life using a procedure that I developed. And if her family wants to sue because the surgeon who saved their mother happens to be black, then that's a fight I'm willing to have." She paused at the threshold. "But I won't stand here and let someone die because of the color of my skin. Not in 1963. Not in 2024. Chen caught her arm. "The liability is nothing compared to the liability of letting a patient die when we could have saved her." She gently removed his hand. "Now, either help me do my job, or get out of my way." As if in response, the overhead speakers crackled. "Dr. Washington, 2 or 3. Stat. Dr. Washington, 2 or 3. She strode through the doors, Chen trailing behind her. Sarah's family stood in the hallway, her husband in an expensive suit, her daughter still in a gala dress. They started forward, protest written on their faces. Dr. Washington didn't break stride. "Mr. Bennett, your wife has a type A aortic dissection variant. Without immediate surgery, she will die. You can either trust the surgeon who literally wrote the book on this procedure, or you can trust your prejudices. But you need to decide right now." She didn't wait for an answer, pushing through the OR doors where her team waited. Behind her, she heard the daughter's voice. "Dad, please, let her try." As Dr. Washington approached the table, Sarah lay unconscious, her life literally in the hands of someone she despised moments ago. The monitoring equipment beeped steadily, counting down the precious minutes. "Scalpel," Dr. Washington said firmly, and felt the familiar weight of the instrument in her palm. Above her surgical mask, her eyes were clear and focused. She had a life to save, and nothing else mattered. Outside, the storm raged on, but in OR 3, Dr. Kimberly Washington prepared to wage her own battle against both death and prejudice, and she intended to win both. "V-fib, she's crashing." The warning blared through OR 3 as Sarah Bennett's heart monitor screamed. Dr. Washington's hands remained steady inside her patient's chest cavity, even as the overhead lights flickered ominously. 3 hours into what should have been a 6-hour surgery, and they were already fighting for survival. "Push another round of amiodarone," Dr. Washington ordered, her voice carrying over the thunder that rattled the windows. "And someone get maintenance on the phone. If we lose power, our backup generator better not fail." The situation was precarious. The innovative procedure she developed required precise visualization of the aortic root, and every time the lights dimmed, they risked disaster. Sarah's aorta had revealed itself to be more damaged than the initial scans had shown, the dissection extending further than anyone had anticipated. Dr. Washington, Jessica, her lead surgical resident, whispered, "There's a tear here that wasn't on the imaging." She pointed to a section of the aorta that looked ready to shred like wet tissue paper. Lightning illuminated the OR in stark white, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The lights flickered again, longer this time, and the backup power hummed to life. "Call downstairs," Dr. Washington directed a nurse. "Make sure the blood bank can get us more O-negative. At this rate, we'll need it." She turned back to the surgical field, her mind racing through modifications to her procedure. This case was worse than any of her previous 3 successes. The OR doors burst open as an administrative nurse rushed in. "Dr. Washington, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Mr. Bennett is demanding updates. He's threatening to call the police, saying you're operating against their will." Dr. Washington didn't look up from her work. "Tell him his wife has received 8 units of blood products, is currently experiencing complications, and if he wants her to live, he needs to let me concentrate." Her tone left no room for argument. "And get me an extra Kelly clamp." As the nurse left, Jessica leaned in closer. "I've never seen a dissection this extensive. Should we consider calling it?" The question hung in the air like the charged particles before lightning strikes. Calling it, declaring the case futile, closing up, and letting Sarah Bennett die, would arguably be the safest option for everyone's careers. No one could fault them for losing a patient with injuries this severe. But Dr. Washington saw something else as she worked, the slight variations in tissue density, the barely perceptible patterns that had led her to develop her innovative technique in the first place. "Look here," she said to Jessica, pointing with her instrument. "See how the tissue plane separates? This is exactly why traditional approaches fail." Another crash of thunder, and this time the lights went completely dark for 3 terrifying seconds before the backup power engaged. In those seconds, Dr. Washington didn't move a millimeter, her hands knowing exactly where they were in Sarah's chest cavity. "Time check," she called out when the lights returned. 3 hours and 22 minutes in, the circulating nurse responded. "Or temperature is dropping with the power fluctuations." Dr. Washington nodded. "Increase the warming blanket setting. The last thing we need is her getting hypothermic." She turned to Jessica. "Now wash carefully. This next part is why they called me crazy at the cardiac surgery conference last year." With precise movements, she began the most delicate part of her procedure, a technique that had earned her both acclaim and skepticism in the cardiac surgery world. It required manipulating the aortic tissue in a way that seemed counterintuitive, but when executed correctly, allowed for a stronger repair. "BP's dropping," the anesthesiologist warned, "down to 82/45. "Come on, Sarah," Dr. Washington murmured. "You don't get to prove them right. Not today." Suddenly, blood began welling up from nowhere and everywhere. "Suction," Dr. Washington called sharply. "More suction. I can't see the field." Jessica moved quickly with the suction, but the bleeding continued. Sarah's blood pressure plummeted further. In that crucial moment, Dr. Washington made a decision. She slightly modified her technique, a variation she'd been theorizing, but hadn't yet attempted. Her fingers moved with certainty born of thousands of hours of surgery, but this was new territory, even for her. "BP stabilizing," the anesthesiologist reported after several tense minutes, coming back up to 90/60. The oar collectively released its held breath. Outside, the storm seemed to be intensifying, but inside, Dr. Washington had found her rhythm. The repair was taking shape under her hands, the innovative technique working even with her on-the-fly modification. Dr. Washington, the administrative nurse, had returned. "Sarah's daughter Emily is asking to observe from the gallery. She's a second-year medical student at Emory." For the first time since the surgery began, Dr. Washington looked up at the observation gallery. Through the glass, she saw a young woman in a rain-soaked evening gown, her face pressed against the window, watching intently as Dr. Washington held her mother's heart in her hands. "Let her in," Dr. Washington said softly. "Sometimes we need to see things for ourselves to understand the truth of them." As Emily entered the gallery above, Dr. Washington returned her focus to her work. There were still hours to go, and the storm wasn't finished with them yet. But in that moment, underneath the complex layers of prejudice and fear, healing of more than one kind was taking place in OR 3. The first thing Sarah Bennett became aware of was the rhythmic beeping of monitors. The second was pain, not the searing agony she remembered from the gala, but a deep, persistent ache in her chest. The third was voices, arguing in what they probably thought were whispers. Most successful implementation of the Washington technique to date. A young female voice was saying, "Mum's case is already being discussed at Emory. They're calling it groundbreaking." Groundbreaking or not, Emily, this is unacceptable. Sarah recognized her husband Richard's clipped tone. That woman had no right. "That woman," Emily interrupted, "is the reason Mom's alive right now. The reason I still have a mother." Sarah tried to open her eyes, but they felt weighted. Through her mental fog, she caught fragments of an overhead news broadcast. Pioneering surgeon Dr. Kimberly Washington performed an emergency cardiac procedure during last night's unprecedented storm. The successful surgery marks only the 4th time. Her eyes snapped open. The hospital room slowly came into focus, all sleek medical equipment and muted beige walls. Emily stood by the window in wrinkled medical student scrubs, while Richard paced in his rumpled tuxedo from the gala. Neither had noticed she was awake. The hospital board is meeting right now, Richard was saying. I've already spoken with our lawyers, operating without proper consent. Dad, stop. Emily's voice cracked. I watched the whole surgery from the gallery. Do you know what I saw? I saw the most brilliant surgical work I've ever witnessed. Dr. Washington made decisions up there that they don't even teach in textbooks yet. When the power kept failing, when Mom's heart wouldn't stabilize, when everyone else was ready to give up, she just wouldn't quit. Sarah tried to speak, but her throat was too dry. She managed a weak cough instead. Mom. Emily rushed to her side while Richard pressed the call button. What happened? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. You had an aortic dissection, Emily explained, holding a water cup with a straw to her mother's lips. A tear in your major blood vessel. It's usually fatal without immediate surgery. Dr. Washington. That black doctor. Sarah's face contorted. You let her operate on me. The room fell silent except for the monitor's steady beeping. Emily stepped back as if she'd been slapped. Mrs. Bennett. A new voice joined them. Dr. Washington stood in the doorway, white coat pristine, tablet in hand. Dark circles under her eyes were the only evidence of her 16-hour surgical marathon. Good to see you're awake. How's your pain level? How dare you? Sarah's voice was weak but venomous. How dare you touch me without consent? Richard, call the board. Call our lawyers. I want her license. Mom. Emily's face flushed with shame. She saved your life. I didn't ask her to. Sarah tried to sit up and gasped at the pain. Dr. Washington moved to adjust her medication, but Richard stepped between them. Don't touch her. We'll be filing a formal complaint with the medical board. Of course you will. Dr. Washington's voice remained professional, but her eyes held something harder. Just like you filed complaints against Dr. Chen last year for hiring too many urban staff. Or like you threatened to pull funding when the hospital started its inner-city outreach program. She picked up Sarah's chart, making notes. But here's what's fascinating, Mrs. Bennett. When you were dying on that table, your heart didn't care about the color of my hands that were fixing it. When you needed 11 units of blood, it didn't come with a race label. And when your daughter was watching from that gallery, learning what real medicine looks like, she wasn't seeing color. She was seeing science and skill and dedication. Through the window behind them, Sarah could see a crowd gathering outside the hospital. News vans were setting up cameras. Your case is going to be published in the New England Journal of Medicine, Dr. Washington continued. The modification I had to make to save your life. It's going to change how this surgery is performed globally. So you can file your complaints and make your threats, but you can't change the fact that every cardiac surgeon who learns this technique will know it came from the hands of a black doctor. She turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and the hospital board meeting you're so excited about. They're not discussing my conduct. They're discussing naming the new cardiac wing after me. Your previous donation is being used to fund it. The monitor showed Sarah's blood pressure rising. Emily quickly adjusted her mother's pillows, trying to help her calm down. You can't. Sarah started. I already did. Dr. Washington's voice softened slightly. Your follow-up appointment is in 3 days. Try to rest until then. Despite what you may believe, Mrs. Bennett, I'm very good at my job. And right now, my job is making sure you heal properly, whether you like it or not. As Dr. Washington left, Sarah caught her reflection in the window. Pale, vulnerable, alive. Outside, reporters were interviewing hospital staff. The headline scrolling across a news van screen read, Groundbreaking surgery performed during storm. Local surgeon makes medical history. Emily sat down heavily in the chair beside her mother's bed. Mom, she said quietly, I need to tell you something. During the surgery, when we almost lost you, I prayed. Not for a white doctor or a different doctor. I prayed for the best doctor. And that's exactly who answered. Sarah turned away from her daughter, toward the window, but not before Emily saw something unexpected glistening in her mother's eyes. the first crack in a lifetime of certainty, as persistent as the ache in her newly repaired heart. Emily Bennett's hands trembled as she unlocked her childhood home, the key sticking in the worn brass lock just as it always had. She'd come to gather fresh clothes for her mother, but the empty house felt different now, heavy with unspoken histories. Upstairs, her mother's bedroom was exactly as she'd left it the night of the gala. An elegant black dress laid out on the bed she hadn't worn, jewelry scattered across the vanity. As Emily gathered clean nightgowns and toiletries, she noticed something peculiar behind the dresser, a leather-bound book that had fallen into the gap. It was her mother's journal from college, its pages yellow with age. Emily knew she shouldn't read it, but something compelled her to open its worn cover. The first entry was dated September 15, 1989. First meeting of the Civil Rights Society today. Dad would kill me if he knew. But after what happened to Marcus at the diner, I can't stay silent anymore. Someone has to stand up. Emily sank onto the edge of the bed, her heart pounding. More entries followed. Helped organize the sit-in at Walker's Cafe. 23 of us showed up. The owner called us race traitors. I don't care. Marched with the Integration Now group. Got my picture in the paper. Kept my face turned away so Dad wouldn't see. Meeting Marcus in secret again. He says we're living proof that love doesn't see color. I believe him. The journal entries stopped abruptly in November. The final page was tear-stained, nearly illegible. They killed him. They killed Marcus. Said it was a robbery gone wrong. But we all know. Dad says this proves he was right all along. Says I need to wake up and see the world as it really is. I can't do this anymore. I can't. Emily's phone buzzed, startling her. It was a text from the hospital. Protesters had gathered outside her mother's room. Dr. Washington stood at her office window, watching the growing crowd below. Signs bobbed in the morning air. No surgery without consent, mixed with Dr. Washington, hero, and black excellence saves lives. You need to see this, Jake said from her doorway, holding up his tablet. Social media was exploding with hot takes on the surgery. Half called her a hero, half demanded her license. But it was the trending video that caught her attention. Grainy footage from 1989, showing a young white woman at a civil rights march. The woman's face was partly hidden, but Dr. Washington recognized Sarah Bennett's profile. There's more, Jake continued. That woman next to her in the video. It's my Aunt Marie. She says Mrs. Bennett was a regular at their meetings until Marcus Johnson was killed. Dr. Washington finished quietly. Everyone in the medical community knew that case. A promising pre-med student found beaten to death. No arrests were ever made. A knock interrupted them. Hospital administrator Chen entered, looking grave. The protests are getting bigger. And there's something else. Mrs. Bennett's father is here. Franklin Sterling. Dr. Washington's jaw tightened. Franklin Sterling, the man whose real estate company had systematically prevented black families from buying homes in certain neighborhoods for decades. He's demanding to see his daughter, Chen continued. But first, he wants to talk to you. No, Jake protested. After everything he's done. I'll see him, Dr. Washington interrupted. But in the chapel. Neutral ground. Emily rushed through the hospital corridors, the journal clutched to her chest. She had to reach her mother before. She stopped short. Through the chapel's open door, she saw Dr. Washington facing her grandfather. Franklin Sterling's imposing figure seemed to fill the small space. You had no right, Sterling was saying, his voice like gravel. That's my daughter. Everyone has the right to live, Mr. Sterling. Dr. Washington replied calmly. Even those you think don't deserve it. You don't understand what you've done. Sterling's hand shook. After Marcus, I had to protect her. Had to make her see. You had to make her hate. Dr. Washington's voice was soft but cutting. Like you taught her to hate Marcus Johnson, a young man whose only crime was loving your daughter. Sterling's face went white. How did you? Because Marcus was my cousin. Dr. Washington said quietly. "And now I've saved your daughter's life using a surgical technique I developed while studying his case files. Life has a way of coming full circle, Mr. Sterling." Emily gasped, drawing their attention. The journal fell from her hands, pages scattering across the chapel floor. Sarah Bennett's hidden past laid bare in ink and tears. From down the hall came the sound of shouting. Sarah Bennett had seen the viral video of her younger self. The monitors in her room were beeping frantically as decades of carefully constructed walls began to crumble. Dr. Washington moved past Sterling and Emily, heading toward her patient's room. She paused at the chapel door. "You can't heal a heart until you admit it's broken," she said. "That's true in surgery, and it's true in life." Behind her, Emily bent to gather the scattered journal pages, each one a piece of her mother's broken truth, while her grandfather stood frozen, watching as the past he buried came rushing back to demand its reckoning. The emergency board meeting of Metropolitan Hospital erupted into chaos as Dr. Victoria Hayes, chief of surgery at Rival Street Luke's Memorial, finished her presentation. The Washington technique was performed without proper vetting or peer review, Hayes declared, her laser pointer circling key points on the projected slides. This hospital allowed an untested procedure on a prominent community member without consent. The liability implications alone. That's enough. The voice came from the back of the boardroom. Sarah Bennett stood in the doorway, gripping an IV pole for support. She wore a hospital gown and robe, her face pale but determined. Emily hovered anxiously beside her, ready to catch her if she fell. "Mrs. Bennett," Board Chairman Wilson rose quickly. "You shouldn't be here. You're still in recovery. I'm exactly where I need to be." Sarah's voice shook, but she stayed upright. "Since you're all talking about my surgery, don't I get a say?" Dr. Washington, seated at the far end of the table, watched silently as her patient made her way to the front of the room. Every step seemed to cost Sarah tremendous effort. "Dr. Hayes," Sarah turned to face the Street Luke surgeon. "You said this procedure was untested. Did you mention that traditional methods had a 20% survival rate for my condition? Did you tell them that you tried to hire Dr. Washington last year after she published her initial research?" Hayes flushed. "That's not relevant, Toe." "It's completely relevant." Sarah reached into her robe pocket and pulled out a weathered journal. "Just like this is relevant." Emily stepped forward. "Mom, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." Sarah opened the journal with trembling hands. 35 years ago, I stood up at a different meeting. I spoke about integration, about equality, about justice. Then something happened that made me bury these beliefs so deep, I almost forgot they were ever part of me. She looked directly at Dr. Washington. Someone I loved was killed for daring to cross the color line. And instead of fighting harder, I surrendered. I let fear and grief twist into hatred. I became exactly what my father wanted, safe, compliant, and filled with prejudice. The room was absolutely silent now. Even Hayes had sunk back into her chair. "Yesterday," Sarah continued, "I watched the viral video of my younger self at that civil rights march. I barely recognized that girl. But what really broke me was learning that Dr. Washington was Marcus Johnson's cousin, that the hands that saved my life were connected to the man whose love I once thought would save my soul." Dr. Washington stood slowly. "Mrs. Bennett, you need to rest. Your heart." "My heart," Sarah laughed softly, bitterly, "has been diseased far longer than any medical chart shows. And you've done more than just repair the physical damage." She turned back to the board. "You want to talk about consent? About liability? Fine. Here's your headline. Local racist saved by black surgeon experiences life-changing epiphany." But that's not even the real story. Sarah's legs buckled slightly, and Emily rushed to support her, but she waved her daughter away, gripping the podium instead. The real story is about a brilliant surgeon who looked past decades of hatred to save someone who didn't deserve saving. About a young doctor. She glanced at Emily, watching and learning that excellence transcends all our artificial barriers. about a hospital that put patient care above prejudice. Hayes stood again. This is all very touching, but Street Luke's has serious concerns about. Street Luke's, Sarah's voice turned sharp, is concerned about losing their top cardiac candidates to Dr. Washington's groundbreaking program. The same program my family's foundation will now be funding with a $20 million grant. Gasps filled the room. Dr. Washington's eyes widened. And yes, Sarah continued, I'm aware of the irony. The money my father made keeping black families out of white neighborhoods will now fund scholarships for minority medical students. Marcus would have appreciated that twist of fate. She turned to Dr. Washington, tears now flowing freely. You said something to me in recovery about how my heart didn't care about the color of your hands when they were saving it. You were right and wrong, because my heart did care. Some part of that scared, loving girl from 35 years ago recognized healing when she felt it, not just of her body, but of her soul. Sarah's knees finally gave way. Emily caught her this time, and Dr. Washington rushed forward to check her pulse. Get a wheelchair, Dr. Washington ordered. Then softer, to Sarah. You've done enough. Not yet, Sarah whispered. She addressed the board one final time. If anyone in this room objects to Dr. Washington's program, they'll have to explain why to every media outlet in the state. I may have been a coward once, but never again. As orderlies wheeled Sarah out, Dr. Hayes quietly packed up her presentation. The board members exchanged glances, knowing the decision had already been made. Emily lingered behind, watching Dr. Washington gather her papers. You know, she said softly, Mom kept every news article about Marcus's death. All these years, she was punishing herself as much as anyone else. Dr. Washington nodded. Sometimes the longest journey is from fear back to love. She checked her watch. Speaking of which, your mother needs her cardiac meds. Coming. Together, they walked out of the boardroom, leaving behind the ghosts of old hatred and new possibilities hanging in the air. The physical therapy room was empty except for Sarah Bennett and the treadmill's steady hum. 3 weeks after surgery, she'd insisted on pushing herself harder than recommended, a trait Dr. Washington had come to recognize in her patient. 2 minutes left, Sarah muttered, sweat beading on her forehead. I can do this. The machine beeped a warning as her heart rate climbed. Suddenly, her knees buckled. Before she could fall, strong hands gripped her shoulders, stabilizing her. Stubborn runs in your family, doesn't it? Dr. Washington's voice was professional, but carried a hint of understanding. She helped Sarah to a nearby chair, checking her pulse. Your daughter has the same determination. I watched her perform her first sutures yesterday. Her technique was flawless. Sarah's breathing slowly steadied. Emily says you're the best teacher she's ever had. She's a natural surgeon, like someone else I once knew. The words hung in the air between them. Sarah's hands twisted in her lap. Marcus, she said softly. He would have been brilliant, wouldn't he? Dr. Washington sat down across from her. He was already brilliant. Top of his class, had his whole residency mapped out. She paused, studying Sarah's face. He used to write to me about you, you know. His secret love who was going to help change the world. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. I still hear them sometimes. The sounds that night. I was supposed to meet him at the library. I was late because my father. Her voice broke. When I finally got there, I saw the police lights. The blood on the sidewalk. I was in high school, Dr. Washington said quietly. When they told us Marcus was dead, my mother held me while I cried. But my father, he went very quiet. He was a doctor too, working at County General. That night, he said something I've never forgotten. They can kill our bodies, but they can't kill our dreams unless we let them. Sarah wiped her eyes. After Marcus, I let them kill my dreams. Worse, I became part of the system that killed them. Every racist comment, every discriminatory action. It was like I was killing Marcus over and over. Fear does that, Dr. Washington acknowledged. It makes us forget who we are. But that girl who loved Marcus, she's still in there. I saw her in the boardroom yesterday." Sarah attempted to stand, wobbling slightly. Dr. Washington reached out automatically to steady her, and this time, Sarah didn't flinch from her touch. "Why didn't you tell them?" Sarah asked. "In the OR, when I was dying, you knew who I was, what I'd done. You knew about Marcus. You could have let me go. Is that what you think Marcus would have wanted?" "No." Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "He believed in healing, not revenge. That's why he wanted to be a doctor." She looked up suddenly. "The technique you used to save me, you developed it studying his case files." Dr. Washington nodded. Marcus had a rare cardiac condition. The autopsy showed an undiagnosed aortic weakness. When I was in medical school, I became obsessed with understanding it. The procedure I created, it started with trying to figure out how I could have saved him. If I'd been old enough, skilled enough. "So in a way," Sarah said slowly, "Marcus did save me. Through you." The physical therapy room door opened, and Emily entered carrying a stack of medical journals. She stopped short, sensing the weight of the moment. "Mom, are you okay?" Sarah reached for her daughter's hand. "Dr. Washington was just telling me about your first sutures. They were nothing compared to what I saw in that OR." Emily's eyes shone with admiration. "The way you modified the technique mid-surgery, it was like watching someone write poetry with their hands." Speaking of modifications, Dr. Washington stood, professional mask back in place. "The journal wants me to present the new procedure at next month's cardiac conference. They've asked me to bring the patient whose case inspired the breakthrough." She looked at Sarah. "Only if you're willing, of course." Sarah gripped her daughter's hand tighter. "Will you tell them about Marcus? I think it's time his story was part of the medical record, don't you?" Sarah nodded, tears flowing freely now. "All these years, I've been living with a dissected heart in more ways than one. Maybe it's time for that to heal too." Emily looked between them, understanding dawning on her face. "Mom, are you saying?" "I'm saying yes." Sarah straightened, wiping her eyes. "Yes to the conference. Yes to telling Marcus's story. Yes to being the person he believed I could be, even if it's 35 years too late." Dr. Washington checked her watch. "Your heart rate's stabilized. Think you can manage one more minute on the treadmill? At a lower speed this time." Sarah took a deep breath and stood. As she stepped back on the machine, she caught Dr. Washington's reflection in the window. For a moment, she thought she saw Marcus standing there too, smiling that bright smile that had first made her question everything she'd been taught to believe. "1 minute," she said firmly. "I can do anything for 1 minute." "Yes," Dr. Washington agreed, adjusting the speed. "That's usually how healing begins. 1 minute at a time." 1 year later, the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Marcus Johnson Center for Cardiovascular Excellence drew a crowd that spilled onto the hospital lawn. News cameras jostled for position as Sarah Bennett approached the podium, her steps strong and sure. Dr. Washington stood beside her, both women ignoring the protesters gathered at the far edge of the property, a smaller group than last year, but still vocal. "My father always told me that money talks," Sarah began, her voice carrying across the crowd. "He meant it as a threat, a way to keep people in line. Today, money is talking again, but it's saying something different." She gestured to the gleaming new building behind her. "This center will provide free cardiac care to underserved communities. Its fellowship program will prioritize minority medical students. And yes, that funding comes from the Sterling family fortune. Money that once built walls will now build bridges." Emily, now in her 3rd year of medical school, watched from the front row, wearing her white coat with pride. Beside her sat Franklin Sterling, markedly aged from the events of the past year, his expression unreadable. "But this center represents more than just money," Sarah continued. "It represents transformation. 1 year ago, I went into cardiac arrest at a charity gala. I was a woman so blinded by prejudice that I would rather have died than let a black doctor touch me. She turned to Dr. Washington. Thank God someone had the courage to save me anyway. Dr. Washington stepped forward, her own voice strong and clear. The procedure that saved Mrs. Bennett's life was developed through years of research, sparked by a personal loss. My cousin, Marcus Johnson, died because of hatred and fear, but his dream of healing others lived on. Today, we're not just opening a medical center. We're fulfilling a promise made 36 years ago. A murmur went through the crowd as large screens displayed a black and white photograph. A young Marcus Johnson in his pre-med lab coat, his smile radiant with hope. Marcus believed that love could transcend prejudice. Sarah's voice cracked slightly. He died for that belief. I buried my love for him beneath decades of hatred, but it never truly died. It waited, like a dormant seed, until the hands of his cousin literally touched my heart and reminded me who I used to be. She reached for the giant ceremonial scissors. The Marcus Johnson Center will train the next generation of cardiac surgeons using the Washington technique, a procedure that proves what Marcus always said. Inside, all our hearts beat the same. As Sarah and Dr. Washington cut the ribbon together, Emily stood and began to applaud. The crowd followed, the sound drowning out the distant protesters. Franklin Sterling remained seated, but those closest saw him wipe his eyes. Inside the new center's lobby, a wall displayed photographs. Marcus Johnson as a pre-med student, Dr. Washington performing her groundbreaking surgery, Sarah at civil rights protests, both past and present, Emily suturing her first patient. Below them, a plaque read, "Healing hearts, changing minds." Later, as the crowd dispersed, Sarah found Dr. Washington in her new office, unpacking medical journals. The first fellowship candidates arrive next week. Dr. Washington said, not looking up, "Your daughter's application was particularly impressive. Emily needs to earn this on her own merit." Sarah replied, "No special treatment. Like the special treatment I gave you in the OR." Their eyes met, and surprisingly, both women smiled. The past year had forged an unexpected bond between them, not quite friendship, but something equally profound. "I spoke to the protesters," Sarah said quietly, "invited them to tour the center, meet the staff, learn about the program. Some actually agreed. Change happens one heart at a time." Dr. Washington nodded. "Speaking of which, how's yours feeling?" "Strong." Sarah touched her chest, both physically and spiritually. "Yes." She pulled something from her bag, Marcus's old notebook, its pages worn but preserved. "I thought this should live here." His notes on cardiac care were ahead of their time. Dr. Washington took the notebook carefully. "You know, Marcus wrote something in his last letter to me. He said, 'Love is the most powerful surgical instrument. It can repair what seems permanently broken.'" Through the office window, they could see Emily showing her grandfather around the new cardiac wing. Franklin Sterling moved slowly, leaning on a cane, but he was there. Another small victory in a year of transformations. A group of medical students passed by, their diverse faces reflecting the center's mission. One young black woman stopped to stare at Marcus's photograph, her expression filled with possibility. "Ready for your first official day as center director?" Sarah asked. Dr. Washington squared her shoulders, ready to keep making history. As they walked out together, they passed the emergency room where their story had begun. The lights were still harsh, the pace still frantic, but something had changed. In a hospital where a black doctor had once fought to save a racist's life, prejudice itself was now on life support. Sarah paused at the exit. "Do you think Marcus would be proud of how far you've come? Of what we've built here?" Dr. Washington held the door open. "I think he always knew this version of you existed. Sometimes it just takes a broken heart to find our way back to who we're meant to be." Outside, the sun was setting on the Marcus Johnson Center for Cardiovascular Excellence, its windows gleaming with promise. Inside, beneath the surface of skin and bone, beyond the boundaries of race and fear, hearts continued to beat, each one carrying the potential for healing. for change, for love. And in the end, that's all Marcus had ever wanted them to understand.